The streets of Boston pulsed with energy, filled with the sights, sounds, and smells of the annual Boston Marathon. It was April 15, 2013, and tens of thousands of spectators lined Boylston Street, cheering for runners from all over the world. Among the sea of faces, indistinguishable in their excitement, two young men moved through the crowd with a calm that belied the chaos they were about to unleash. Tamerlan and Tsarnaev blended into the mass of people, their backpacks slung casually over their shoulders. The day was warm, and there was no hint of the terror that would soon grip the city. They walked with a sense of purpose, though their eyes flickered with a darkness that few around them could recognize. Every step was calculated, every glance rehearsed, and as they approached the finish line, the younger brother, Jakar, felt the cold steel of inevitability. For days, they had planned this moment, fine-tuning their devices, calculating the crowd flow, and rehearsing their exits. Their backpacks, now bulging with pressure cooker bombs packed with nails and ball bearings, felt heavier with each passing second. The weight of their mission, of their own convictions, settled on their shoulders like a physical burden. Tamerlan stopped near a crowd gathered by the finish line, his face set in stone, scanning for the perfect spot. The noise was deafening. Cheers, footsteps, applause. Everything melted into a single, overwhelming roar, and in the midst of it all, he calmly placed his backpack near a group of families. A father held his daughter high on his shoulders, her small hands flailing as she cheered for her mother, a runner approaching the final stretch. A chill ran through Jakar's spine as he followed his brother's lead, setting his own bag down farther along the street. His heart pounded in his chest, a frantic beat against the rhythm of the marathon. But his face gave nothing away. They walked away, merging back into the throng of people. Every step seemed endless. Would someone notice? Would someone call them out? Time felt like it had slowed, each second drawing them closer to the point of no return. As they distanced themselves, Tamerlan glanced at his phone, his thumb hovering over the trigger app. The clock struck 2:49 p.m. The first explosion tore through the jubilant atmosphere like a thunderclap. People screamed as smoke and debris shot into the air. Blood spattered across the pavement. In the chaos, confusion reigned. For a moment, there was a stunned silence, an incomprehensible stillness before reality hit. Then came the second blast. Jakar felt it, even though he was blocks away by then, his legs carrying him faster than his thoughts could process. The city descended into panic, sirens, shouts, the rapid footsteps of fleeing bystanders. Smoke rose in columns above the historic streets of Boston. Tamerlan had already disappeared into the chaos, but Jakar was struggling to stay calm, to blend in. His mind raced. He needed to get away, to hide. The next few hours were a blur. Emergency services arrived, first responders wading into the carnage. News helicopters circled above, broadcasting images of the devastation to the world. 3 people dead, hundreds injured, limbs lost, lives shattered. But in the aftermath, a shadow had already begun to form. The FBI and Boston police scrambled for answers. At first, no one knew what had happened. Was it an accident? A terrorist attack? And then, as the dust began to settle, suspicions arose. Security cameras from stores along Boylston Street had captured something. 2 young men, backpacks slung low, walking with an unnatural ease. Special Agent Richard Delorier, the lead investigator, sat in a dimly lit room staring at the footage. His gut twisted as he watched the grainy images of the suspects. There was something about their walk, the casual nature of it, that made his skin crawl. He rewound the footage again and again, fixating on their faces. Who were they? Where had they gone? The manhunt was about to begin. News channels were already flashing the images of the 2 suspects, but no one had identified them yet. Boston turned into a city under siege. Delorier coordinated with local police, putting the city into lockdown, combing through every lead, every tip. People were scared. The marathon, a symbol of strength and unity, had become a nightmare. And yet, even in the face of such devastation, Boston held firm. Strangers helped the wounded, donated blood, and stood together. The city refused to crumble. But the suspects were still out there, lurking somewhere in the shadows, and the clock was ticking. 2 days later, a tip came in that changed everything. A college classmate of Jakar's had seen the news and recognized his face. Couldn't be him, she thought. Jakar had always seemed so quiet, so normal. But as more footage surfaced, her certainty grew. It was him. The FBI closed in fast. The Tsarnaev brothers had gone to ground, hiding in Watertown, a small suburb outside Boston. But they hadn't been careful enough. That night, the quiet streets of Watertown erupted into a deadly firefight. Tamerlan, the elder brother, was cornered first. He fired at police, throwing homemade bombs in a desperate attempt to escape. But it wasn't enough. In a hail of gunfire, he was shot down. But Jakar slipped away. As dawn approached, Boston was a city gripped by fear, but also a city on the verge of justice. The younger Tsarnaev had disappeared into the darkness, wounded, but still dangerous. Delorier knew they were close. They had to be. But every minute Jakar remained free was a minute he could strike again. The tension mounted as law enforcement scoured every inch of Watertown. Doors were kicked in, backyards searched. Residents were told to stay inside. No one could rest, not until the final brother was caught. Then a breakthrough. A man checking his boat in his backyard noticed blood. Delorier's heart raced as the call came in. The boat's cover had been disturbed. Could it be him? A SWAT team descended, surrounding the property. Officers approached slowly, guns drawn, nerves stretched to the breaking point. The entire city of Boston held its breath. But Jakar wasn't going down without a fight. As they closed in, gunshots rang out from the boat. The standoff had begun. It was a showdown that would push the FBI, the police, and the entire nation to its limits. The standoff in Watertown turned the quiet suburban street into a war zone. Tactical lights cut through the darkness, illuminating the boat where Jakar Tsarnaev hid. Blood dripped from the side, staining the white hull. Inside, Jakar lay low, gripping a gun with hands that trembled from exhaustion and pain. His mind was racing, survival instincts battling the overwhelming realization that this could be his end. Special Agent Delorier stood a few yards away from the tactical team, his radio crackling with reports of movements. Every decision now was crucial. Too much force, and they risked killing the suspect without learning why. But hesitation could give Jakar the chance to retaliate, to take more lives. The negotiators tried to establish contact, shouting for Jakar to surrender. Minutes dragged by like hours. The tension was suffocating. The entire city of Boston watching in real time as law enforcement wrestled with how to end this without more bloodshed. Suddenly, gunfire erupted from the boat, splintering the air. The officers responded with overwhelming force, bullets slamming into the boat's side. A tactical decision meant to subdue but not kill. Delorier clenched his fists. He needed this suspect alive. They needed answers. The gunfire died down, and a hush fell over the street. The negotiators made one last plea. "Come out with your hands up, Jakar. It's over." Silence. Delorier's heart pounded. Was it over? Had the young man inside succumbed to his wounds? Or was this the calm before another storm? He scanned the faces of the officers around him, all of them alert, waiting for any movement. Then, slowly, the boat's cover shifted. Jakar, his face pale and streaked with blood, rose from the shadows. His movements were sluggish, his body barely able to keep him upright. He raised his hands, his eyes glazed, as though the weight of the world had finally settled on his shoulders. Officers rushed forward, guns trained on the wounded suspect. Within moments, Jakar was dragged from the boat and pinned to the ground. His hands were cuffed, and for the first time since the bombs had ripped through the streets of Boston, the tension broke. But as the city breathed a collective sigh of relief, Delorier's mind churned. This wasn't the end, it couldn't be. The Tsarnaev brothers had been young, inexperienced, and yet they had pulled off one of the most devastating attacks on American soil. How? And why? As Jakar was loaded into an ambulance, weak but alive, Delorier couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there were still pieces missing. The brothers had operated alone, but had they truly been unaided? What had radicalized them so deeply, so quickly? The questions lingered as investigators swarmed Jakar's hospital room. Despite his injuries, they weren't about to waste any time. They needed answers fast. Days passed, and Boston began to heal, though the scars ran deep. Families mourned, survivors struggled with physical and emotional trauma, and a city that had always prided itself on resilience found itself united in grief and anger. The phrase "Boston Strong" echoed across the nation, but the shadows of the bombing loomed over everything. The investigation into the Tsarnaev brothers' motives only grew murkier with each passing day. In his hospital bed, Jakar was silent for the first 24 hours. His face was gaunt, pale from blood loss and the exhaustion of a man who had run from the law, from his own conscience, for too long. His legal team had arrived, advising him to say as little as possible, but the authorities pressed hard. Delorier, determined to uncover every facet of the case, led the interrogation, but it felt like they were running into a wall of silence. Jakar was damaged, not just physically but mentally. He was hardened, yet the confusion in his eyes told Delorier there was more to his story. The media swarmed, each outlet spinning their own version of the Tsarnaev brothers' motives. Some said they were lone wolves, radicalized by extremist propaganda. Others speculated about connections to overseas terror groups, painting them as pawns in a larger, darker game. But Delorier needed facts. The FBI needed the truth, and the truth was proving elusive. One day, as the team sifted through the brothers' digital footprint, they found something. An encrypted message hidden deep within one of Jakar's emails. It was short, cryptic, and seemed to reference a third party, someone who had provided guidance. But who? And more importantly, was this person still out there, plotting something even worse? Delorier's blood ran cold. The idea that there could be more players involved, hidden in plain sight, turned the entire investigation on its head. The bombing had been horrific, but what if it was just the beginning? What if the brothers had merely been the first wave of a much larger, more insidious plan? FBI analysts worked day and night to crack the code, poring over every bit of data they could find. Meanwhile, Jakar's condition improved, and with it came renewed hope that he might eventually break his silence. But Delorier knew they were running out of time. The deeper they dug, the more it seemed like something much larger was at play. And then, a break came, an intercepted communication between an unknown source and a location in the Middle East. The message was brief, but the meaning was clear. Boston was just the first strike. The mastermind behind it all, a shadowy figure known only by a code name, the Architect, was still out there, planning the next attack. Delorier felt the walls closing in. They had Jakar in custody, but the real enemy was still in the shadows, pulling strings, orchestrating chaos from afar. The Boston Marathon bombing had been a brutal warning, and the worst part? It might have been a test run. The clock was ticking, and Delorier knew they were on borrowed time. Somewhere out there, in the dark corners of the world, the Architect was already setting the next phase of his plan in motion. The clock was ticking, and the tension in the FBI's Boston office had reached its breaking point. The discovery of the Architect had thrown the investigation into a race against time. Delorier knew they had to act fast, or the consequences would be catastrophic. The bombing at the marathon had shaken the world, but now the realization dawned on him. It was merely a prologue. Sleepless nights turned into desperate hours as the team scrambled to identify this shadowy figure. Clues were scarce, and every lead seemed to hit a dead end. The encrypted message recovered from Jakar's email was slowly unraveling, but each step forward only deepened the mystery. Who was the Architect, and what could they want? In the hospital, Jakar Tsarnaev had begun to break. The pain of his injuries and the weight of what he had done gnawed at his resolve. Delorier stood in the sterile room, face to face with the young man who had left the city in fear. "You don't have to protect him anymore," Delorier said, his voice low, trying to break through. "Who is the Architect?" Jakar's face twitched, his eyes vacant but trembling with something. Fear, perhaps guilt. After a long silence, he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "He's everywhere. "You'll never find him." Delorier felt a chill run down his spine. Jakar's words weren't bravado. They were the terrified ramblings of someone who had been manipulated, used, and discarded. The FBI needed a breakthrough, and fast. Every second lost was another step closer to another bomb, another tragedy. Then came the breakthrough they needed. One of the cryptographers working on the case, a quiet but brilliant analyst, had managed to crack a portion of the encrypted messages exchanged between Jakar and the architect. It revealed coordinates, a location, somewhere remote in Europe. The FBI acted swiftly, coordinating with Interpol and local authorities to raid the suspected hideout. As tactical teams breached the compound, they discovered something chilling: blueprints. Not just for bombs, but for cyberattacks, mass casualty events, and a horrifying plan for coordinated global strikes. The architect's vision was bigger than anything they had imagined. But the architect was gone. All they found were traces, burned files, shattered hard drives, and empty rooms that had been hastily evacuated. Yet, in the chaos of the raid, they uncovered one vital clue: a journal. It was filled with codes, plans, and fragments of the architect's twisted ideology. But what struck Delorier most was the final page, written in neat, deliberate handwriting. "The world is my canvas. Fear is my paint. No city, no country, no government can stop what's already in motion." Delorier knew then that they hadn't just stopped an attack, they had delayed a war. The architect was still out there, and this shadowy figure's influence extended far beyond Boston. The fight had only begun. But there was a moral to be found in the wreckage of these events, in the tragedy of the marathon bombing. As the months passed, and as Boston began to heal, Delorier reflected on what had transpired. In the face of terror, fear, and chaos, the people of Boston had stood strong. Strangers had become heroes, and the city had rallied together to overcome unimaginable pain. The moral was simple, yet profound. Fear can be a powerful weapon, but unity is stronger. The Tsarnaev brothers and those who sought to destroy had failed not because of law enforcement alone, but because people refused to be broken. The true strength of a city, of a nation, wasn't in its walls or its governments. It was in the courage of its people to stand tall in the face of darkness. The architect may still be out there, but as Delorier stared out over the recovering city, he knew one thing for sure: terror could not win where people stood together.